I'm Susan McGinnis with Clean Skies News at the G20 Summit in Pittsburgh. I'm talking now with Professor John Kirton of the University of Toronto. He's also the director of the G20 Research Group. Professor, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Tell us about this G20 Research Group. What is your mission here?
Well, the G20 Research Group is a global network of scholars, professionals, students, whose mission is to serve as the world's leading independent source of information and analysis on the G20.
So as opposed to what we're hearing from the government itself and from the media here and also from the NGOs here who have some differing opinions, what's your sense of how these talks are going so far?
I think it's shaping up very well. This was the kind of summit where there wouldn't be one big $1.1 trillion announcement at the end that would wow everyone. It was more a matter of taking a rather broad agenda and sort of moving the yardsticks ahead as much as possible. The first big thing, of course, a strong unified message: stay the course on stimulus until the recovery is locked in, then a sensible exit strategy, then a medium-term framework for global growth so we don't create the old imbalances. And only with those economic foundations in place could they take up some of the other issues: trade liberalization, but importantly, climate finance.
Right, so how important, did climate change get as big a seat at the table at this summit as was thought or hoped?
Well, we don't know. It's being discussed today, but I do think the initial signs are encouraging. It was only at the last summit in London that climate change came onto the G20 agenda at all. From the beginning of the preparations for Pittsburgh, the one big issue that the leaders knew they had to do was climate finance, to come up with a credible framework for financing climate change mitigation and adaptation, so the environment ministers at Copenhagen would know that there would be money on offer if they made the concessions to get a new Beyond Kyoto deal. And I think we're moving ahead in that direction.
So following all of these G8, G20 meetings along the way, are you seeing climate change gain a larger part of the time spent here?
Oh, very much. And I think we always have to remember that in the broad story of global climate governance, it began at a G7 summit a long time ago in 1979. So we've known from the beginning of the great things that these G summits can do. And I think under Barack Obama's leadership, we are seeing Pittsburgh moving in that direction, perhaps living up to the legacy.
So do you agree that the momentum is gaining now, where it had been pretty much slacking off about just how much could be had in December?
Well, of course, what we've seen until the leaders met here and got down to work today was the typical UN process. Too many people, only ministers, with a tendency to recreate the old north-south divisions of old. But here in the G20, from the very beginning, it was 20 equals from all parts of the world coming together to deal with systemic problems. So not just the powerful, but some of the vulnerable too, but clearly the countries that count. And here one of the most encouraging signs is to see the impressive leadership on climate change from the South. So the real leader is now Indonesia, which is just a little while ago made a unilateral commitment that it would reduce its carbon emissions and net carbon footprint by 1/3 by about 2020 by bringing the power of sinks and forestry back in. That's something the UN process really hadn't been able to do. It's only at a G20 that you can unleash that kind of power and common sense to get the job done on time.
Now tell me about future meetings of the G20. Are they set? I'm getting the sense that it seems to be a very fluid kind of organization. We don't really get agendas. There's actually talk that there will be meetings, there may not be any more meetings. What's the future for the G20?
Well, the American administration, of course, refers to it as a process, but I think it's becoming and will become by the end of today an institution. Very likely to be a fourth G20 summit, almost certainly in South Korea in the spring. And remember, South Korea is the country that claims that its stimulus is the greatest, greenest stimulus of all the countries. 100% green, they claim. So that's good news on the climate front. But then I think you'll see at the G8 Plus Summit in Muskoka up in Ontario next June that the economic session will be a G20 session. So another G20 summit, but then the day after we'll probably have the Major Economies Forum of the 17 dealing with climate change.
Right.
So it's there in 2 days that you can get the environment economy connection that really has eluded other forums like the UN.
Right. All right. Well, the process continues, and we will be following all of those meetings. John Kirton from the G20 Research Group, thank you.
Pleasure.
And I'm Susan McGinnis with Clean Skies News at the G20 Summit in Pittsburgh.